You know, it's pretty wild when you think about it. Just 27 words written way back in the 18th century are at the absolute heart of one of the most intense and emotional debates in America today. These words have been picked apart, fought over, and taken all the way to the Supreme Court, time and time again. So let's really dig in and try to understand what the Second Amendment is all about. And there they are, the 27 words. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Every single phrase, even the commas, has been the subject of fierce argument. But really, the entire modern controversy boils down to one huge question. Is this amendment just protecting the right of states to have organized militias, like the National Guard? Or does it guarantee your personal individual right to own a gun for your own reasons, like protecting your home? That is the core of the fight. And to figure out how we even got to this point, we've got to rewind the clock, way back. Okay, so let's picture it. It's the late 1700s. The United States is brand new, kind of shaky, and the people who founded it are incredibly suspicious of powerful central governments. And they had this one specific fear that really shaped everything they did. For these guys, a standing army, a full-time professional military, was basically the ultimate tool of a tyrant. They had seen it happen in Europe, where kings used armies to control their own people. Their answer to this threat? The citizen militia. Just regular folks with their own guns, ready to defend their communities. And this idea was front and center during the debate over the new Constitution. So you've basically got two teams arguing. On one side, you have the Federalists. They're saying, look, if this new country is going to survive, the federal government has to have the power to raise a real army and have some control over the state militias. But on the other side, the anti-federalists were just terrified by this. They thought it was like handing the new government a weapon it could one day use to disarm the states and take away everyone's freedom. But here's what's so fascinating. For all their fighting, both sides started from two shared beliefs. First, they all agreed that the new Constitution was in fact giving the federal government control over the military. But second, and this is the big one, they all agree that the federal government should have absolutely zero power to take guns away from the citizens. They saw an armed population as the final check, the ultimate guarantee against a tyrannical government. So, the Second Amendment gets passed, and you'd think that's that. The words are set in stone. But the thing is, the America it was written for started to change almost right away, and those changes would completely reshape how we think about this right. For starters, that whole idea of a citizen militia, it kind of just faded away over time. At the same time, military weapons evolved like crazy, creating this huge gap between what a soldier carries and what a civilian owns. The main reason people said they owned a gun started to shift, from being ready for militia duty to being more about personal protection. And then, a massive legal change happened. See, for a really long time, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, was seen as a set of rules for the federal government only. States could and did pass their own gun laws. But then, after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment comes along, and it introduces this massive question. Should the rights in the Bill of Rights now apply to state governments too? For more than 100 years, the courts didn't really have a clear answer. Believe it or not, for most of American history, the Supreme Court had very little to say about the Second Amendment. It was like this sleepy, forgotten corner of the Constitution. Well, that all changed in the 21st century. 4 huge cases, all in just the last couple of decades, have completely rewritten the rulebook on gun rights in America. And you really have to look at them together because each one builds on a last, creating the legal world we live in right now. And this was the earthquake. Heller. For the very first time in American history, the Supreme Court officially said that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to own a gun for self-defense in the home, completely separate from militia service. It was a razor-thin 5-4 decision, and it struck down a handgun ban in Washington, D.C. But here's a really important catch. Even as the court created this new individual right, it also said, hold on, this right isn't unlimited. The majority opinion specifically listed some types of gun control that were probably still totally fine, what they called presumptively lawful regulations. So Heller applied to Washington, D.C., which is federal territory. The immediate next question was, what about Chicago, or Denver, or your town? Well, 2 years later, the court answered that in McDonald. They took that 14th Amendment question and said, yes, the individual right to bear arms applies to the states too. And just like that, the Heller ruling went nationwide.
All right, so for about a decade after that, lower courts were kind of all over the place trying to figure out how to apply these rulings. Then in 2022, the Bruin case came along and just threw out the old playbook. The court created a brand new test. From now on, if a government wants to pass a gun law, it has to prove that the law fits with the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation.
And this is where you can really see the split on the court. The majority basically said history is all that matters, forget balancing public safety interests. But the dissenters fired back, saying this history-only test is just not workable. They made the point that, just because a certain kind of law didn't exist in 1791 doesn't mean the founders would have thought it was unconstitutional today. So how does this new history and tradition test actually work in the real world? Well, we got our first big test case in 2024 with Rahimi. The case was about a federal law that says if you have a domestic violence restraining order against you, you can't have a gun. The court, in a nearly unanimous 8-1 vote, said the law was constitutional. But, and this is a huge but, even with that lopsided vote, they still disagreed on how to use history. The majority looked back and said, yeah, we found old laws that took guns away from people who were considered dangerous. But Justice Thomas, the guy who actually wrote the Bruin opinion, was the lone dissenter. He argued that those old laws weren't anything like a modern restraining order, which takes away a constitutional right before you've even been convicted of a crime. So you take these four huge cases, Heller, McDonald, Bruin, and Rahimi, and where does it leave us? Well, it leaves us in a pretty confusing and uncertain place. The Supreme Court has drawn a new map, but nobody's quite sure how to read it. And I think this quote from legal scholars Nelson Lund and Adam Winkler just hits the nail on the head. The result is that Second Amendment doctrine remains profoundly unsettled. After all these major rulings, we seem to have more questions than answers. The fallout from this is very real. You have lower court judges all across the country who are now being forced to act like history professors. They're digging through centuries-old documents to decide if a 21st century gun law is constitutional. And the result, you get totally different rulings on very similar laws depending on where you live. It's chaotic. Which brings us to the final lingering question. The Supreme Court has decided that the past is the key to the future of gun rights. But history isn't some simple instruction manual. It's messy, it's complicated, and people disagree on what it means. So the real challenge now, for the courts and for the country, is figuring out whose version of history and which traditions will be the ones that define those original 27 words for all of us.